Welcome to my channel, where we explore dark and mysterious tales from the medieval times. Take a moment to get comfortable, adjust your pillows, and let your mind drift into a world of whispered legends. If you enjoy tonight's stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm on the journey to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. I'd also love if you could comment below, letting me know what time it is and where you're listening from tonight. Now, with the candlelight flickering and shadows dancing, let's dive deep into our first medieval horror story. Story 1. The Miller's Daughter. Aldous, his hands calloused and strong from years spent shaping iron, was a familiar figure in the small village nestled beside the river Wind. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the glowing metal of his forge was a constant, comforting sound, a testament to his honest labor. He was a young man, barely past his 20th year, with a sturdy build, kind eyes, and a quiet demeanor that belied a passionate heart. His days were filled with the honest work of his trade, shoeing horses, crafting tools, and occasionally, when commissioned by the lord of the nearby manor, forging weapons. Life in the village was simple, predictable, and generally peaceful, punctuated by the changing seasons and the occasional traveling merchant or wandering minstrel. It was during one of the village's infrequent festivals, a celebration of the harvest, that Aldous first truly noticed Helena, the miller's daughter. He had seen her before, of course. The mill, a large, creaking structure with its water wheel constantly turning, was a central part of village life. Everyone relied on it to grind their grain, and the miller, a stout, gruff man named Thomas, was a figure of some importance. Helena, however, had always seemed to blend into the background, a fleeting presence as she helped her father or ran errands. But on this particular evening, amidst the lively music and dancing, her voice rose above the general merriment. It was a voice like the song of a nightingale, clear and pure, with a haunting melody that seemed to weave its way into the very soul. Aldous, who had been standing near the edge of the crowd, watching the festivities with a quiet smile, found himself drawn to the sound. He moved closer, his gaze searching for the source of the enchanting music. There she was, standing on a makeshift stage in the village square, surrounded by other young women, but her voice was the one that captivated him. Her eyes were closed as she sang, her face serene and beautiful in the flickering torchlight. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, cascaded down her back, and her simple dress seemed to shimmer in the warm evening air. Aldous felt a strange stirring within him, a feeling he had never experienced before. He was mesmerized, unable to look away. Over the following weeks, Aldous found himself seeking out opportunities to be near Helena. He would linger near the mill, pretending to have business with her father, just to catch a glimpse of her. He learned her routines, the times she would fetch water from the well, or tend to the small garden behind their house. He would offer to help her with tasks, carrying heavy sacks of flour or mending fences around the mill. At first, their interactions were brief and somewhat awkward, but slowly, a connection began to form between them. Helena, he discovered, was as kind and gentle as her singing suggested. She had a quiet grace about her, a gentle smile that could light up a room. She spoke softly, her words often filled with a thoughtful wisdom that belied her young age. She shared stories of her life at the mill, the constant rhythm of the turning wheel, the smell of fresh flour, the satisfaction of providing sustenance for the village. Aldous, in turn, told her about his work at the forge, the heat of the fire, the strength required to shape metal, the pride he felt in his craft. As they spent more time together, their initial shyness began to fade, replaced by a comfortable familiarity. Aldous found himself looking forward to their conversations, eager to hear her voice, to see her smile. He learned about her dreams and her fears, her love for the surrounding countryside, her quiet sadness over the recent passing of her mother. He, in turn, shared his own hopes for the future, his desire to one day have his own workshop, his growing realization that his future was intertwined with hers. Their courtship was simple and unhurried, consisting of stolen moments and shared glances. They would walk together along the riverbank, the gentle murmur of the water providing a soothing backdrop to their conversations. They would sit beneath the ancient oak tree at the edge of the village, sharing stories and dreams as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Aldous would often bring her small gifts, a carefully crafted iron flower, a smooth, gray stone he had found by the river, tokens of his growing affection. Helena seemed to cherish these small gestures, her eyes sparkling with gratitude whenever he presented her with one. Her laughter, when it came, was like the tinkling of bells, a joyful sound that made Aldous' heart soar. He found himself falling deeply in love with her, captivated by her beauty, her kindness, and her gentle spirit. He imagined a future with her, a life filled with the simple joys of village life, their days spent together, their evenings filled with her beautiful singing. Then, a shadow began to fall over their burgeoning happiness. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Helena's mother, a kind and hard-working woman, had fallen ill suddenly and passed away within a matter of days. The village mourned her loss, for she had been a well-liked member of the community, always ready with a helping hand or a kind word. Helena was understandably devastated by her mother's death. She became quieter, more withdrawn, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a palpable sadness. Aldous did his best to comfort her, spending time with her, offering words of solace, and helping with the chores around the mill. He knew that grief took time, and he was prepared to be patient, to stand by her side as she navigated her sorrow. However, as the weeks passed, Aldous began to notice a change in Helena that went beyond simple grief. She became increasingly withdrawn. Her once bright eyes now held a haunted look. She stopped singing. The beautiful melodies that had once filled the air around the mill were now replaced by an unsettling silence. More disturbingly, Helena began to exhibit a strange fear of the mill itself. She would avoid going inside whenever possible, and when she had to, she would move quickly, her eyes darting around nervously as if she expected something terrible to leap out from the shadows. She would often clutch her father's arm tightly when they were near the building, her knuckles white with tension. Aldous found this behavior particularly perplexing. Helena had grown up in the mill. It was her home, the place where she had spent her entire life. Why would she suddenly be so afraid of it? The villagers, attributing her behavior solely to her grief, offered words of sympathy and understanding. They spoke of the heavy burden of loss, the way it could cloud the mind and fill the heart with fear. They told Aldous to be patient with her, to give her time to heal. But Aldous couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. There was a deep, unsettling fear in Helena's eyes, a terror that seemed to go beyond the natural sadness of mourning. He had seen grief before, in others and even in himself, but this was different. This was something darker, something more profound. He watched her carefully, his heart filled with a growing unease, wondering what secret lay hidden beneath the surface of her sorrow. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the mill held a secret, and that secret was somehow connected to the change he saw in the woman he loved. The unsettling silence that had fallen over the miller's daughter was a stark contrast to the melodious voice Aldous had first fallen in love with. He tried to talk to her, to gently inquire about her fears, but she would only shake her head, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't articulate. Her father, Thomas, remained gruff and dismissive, attributing her behavior to lingering grief and the delicate nature of women. He warned Aldous not to trouble her, to let her come to terms with her loss in her own way. But Aldous couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was hiding something, that his dismissiveness was a carefully constructed facade. Driven by his love for Helena and his growing suspicion, Aldous began to observe the mill more closely. He would often linger nearby, pretending to work on a fence or repair a tool for a neighboring farmer, his gaze fixed on the old stone building. He noticed that the mill seemed to be running almost constantly, day and night, even when there was no apparent need for so much grinding. The water wheel turned relentlessly, its rhythmic creaking echoing through the valley, a sound that had once been comforting but now seemed to carry a sinister undertone. He also observed Thomas, the miller, The man had always been somewhat rough around the edges, but lately, he seemed even more irritable and secretive. He would often enter and leave the mill late at night, carrying heavy sacks that didn't seem to contain grain. Aldous had once offered to help him, but Thomas had brusquely refused, his eyes darting nervously as he hurried inside. This secrecy only fueled Aldous' suspicions. One evening, as dusk began to settle over the village, Aldous decided to approach the mill under the cover of darkness. He moved stealthily, keeping to the shadows, his blacksmith's training surprisingly useful in allowing him to move quietly. He crept closer to the mill, the sound of the turning water wheel growing louder with each step. He peered through a crack in the wooden wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The interior of the mill was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern. The air was thick with dust, but it wasn't the familiar dust of ground grain. This dust had a different texture, a different smell, something acrid and unsettling that made Aldous' stomach churn. And then he saw it. Beneath the massive millstone, instead of the usual collection bin for flour, there was a large wooden chest. Thomas was there, his back to Aldous, shoveling something from a sack into the chest. Aldous strained his eyes, trying to make out what it was. In the dim light, it was difficult to tell, but it looked like bones. Small, white fragments that could only be the remains of animals, or perhaps something far more sinister. A wave of nausea washed over Aldous. What was the miller doing with bones? Why was the mill running constantly? And where was Helena's mother? The villagers believed she had succumbed to a sudden illness, but Aldous had never seen her sick. One day she was there, tending her garden, and the next she was gone. A cold dread began to creep into Aldous' heart, a feeling that something terrible was happening in their quiet village, something connected to the mill and the miller's strange behavior. Driven by this horrifying realization, Aldous decided to investigate further. He knew he needed more proof, more information before he could confront Thomas or alert the other villagers. He began to ask discreet questions, trying to piece together any unusual occurrences in the village. He spoke to the farmers who brought their grain to the mill, the woodcutter who worked in the nearby forest, the old woman who lived alone at the edge of the village. Slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Over the past few months, several people had gone missing from the village. A young shepherd who had taken his flock to graze in the hills, a traveling merchant who had stopped at the village inn for the night, even a young child who had been playing near the river. Their disappearances had been met with concern, of course, but in a time when life was often precarious, such things were sadly not unheard of. People assumed they had wandered off and gotten lost, or perhaps fallen victim to wild animals. No one had suspected anything more sinister. But now, listening to the hushed whispers and fragmented memories of the villagers, Aldous began to see a connection. All of the missing people had been last seen near the mill or in the woods surrounding it. The shepherd's dog had returned to the village alone, whimpering and distressed. The merchant's cart had been found abandoned on the road leading to the mill. The child's favorite toy had been discovered near the riverbank, not far from the mill's water wheel. A terrifying thought took root in Aldous' mind, a thought so dreadful that it made his blood run cold. Could the bones he had seen in the mill be the remains of these missing villagers? Was the mill not grinding grain, but something far more horrifying? And what did this have to do with Helena's mother and Helena's growing fear? He remembered the stories whispered in hushed tones around the village, tales of old mills that demanded a terrible price for their productivity, of ancient pacts made with dark forces. He had always dismissed them as folklore, as the fanciful imaginings of superstitious peasants. But now, looking back at the strange events of the past few months, at Helena's terror, at the miller's secrecy, he began to wonder if there was more truth to those old tales than he had ever imagined. He knew he had to act, and quickly. Whatever dark secret the mill held, Helena was somehow at the center of it. Her fear was palpable, her silence deafening. He couldn't stand by and watch as she was consumed by whatever terror gripped her. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how jasna it might be. He had to protect her, even if it meant facing a darkness he couldn't yet comprehend. The relentless turning of the millstone, once a symbol of life and sustenance, now seemed to Aldous like a countdown, each rotation bringing Helena closer to some unknown, dreadful fate. He felt a surge of determination mixed with a growing sense of dread. He had to find out what was happening at the mill, and he had to do it before it was too late. The answers, he feared, lay hidden within the shadows of the old stone building, waiting to be revealed. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that those answers would be far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. The weight of his suspicions pressed down on Aldous, a suffocating burden that stole his sleep and haunted his waking hours. He knew he couldn't simply confront Thomas without concrete proof. The miller was a strong man, and the villagers, though perhaps harboring their own unspoken fears, would likely side with a familiar face against a young outsider. Aldous needed irrefutable evidence of the horrors he suspected were taking place within the mill. Under the cloak of another moonless night, Aldous returned to the mill. This time he was determined to get inside. He circled the building, his eyes scanning for any point of entry. The heavy wooden doors were bolted from the inside, and the few small windows were shuttered and latched. Finally, he noticed a small, grimy opening near the base of the mill, a narrow gap where a section of the foundation stones had shifted slightly over time. It was barely large enough to squeeze through, but Aldous, lean and agile, knew it was his only chance. Taking a deep breath, he lay flat on the damp earth and began to wriggle through the opening. The rough stones scraped against his clothes, and the air inside was thick with the same unsettling, acrid dust he had smelled before. He emerged into the dimly lit interior of the mill, his heart pounding in his chest. The only sound was the relentless creaking of the water wheel and the low groan of the massive millstone as it turned. He moved cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The lantern he had seen before was gone, but a faint, eerie glow emanated from beneath the millstone itself. He crept closer, his senses on high alert. The smell of dust was overpowering now, mixed with a faint, metallic odor that made his stomach clench. Peering beneath the edge of the massive stone, Aldous gasped. The chest he had seen earlier was still there, overflowing with bone fragments. But now, in the faint, otherworldly light, he could see them more clearly. They were not just animal bones. Mixed in with the smaller fragments were larger pieces, undeniably human. Skulls, ribs, finger bones. The horrifying reality of his suspicions crashed down upon him with brutal force. But the true horror lay within the millstone itself. As he watched, mesmerized and terrified, he saw faint shapes moving within the grinding surfaces. They were translucent, ethereal, like figures trapped within the very fabric of the stone. And then, he heard it, a faint, mournful whisper, a sound so filled with sorrow and despair that it pierced him to his very core. He recognized the voice. It was Helena's mother. The horrifying truth became sickeningly clear. The mill wasn't grinding grain. It was grinding the bones of the missing villagers, their life force somehow powering the unnatural productivity of the mill. And Helena's mother, her soul was trapped within the millstone, forced to endure this agonizing existence. Aldous realized with a jolt of terror that Helena's silence, her fear, stemmed from the knowledge of this terrible secret. Her father, driven by some dark bargain, was sacrificing innocent lives to keep the mill running, and Helena was next. Just as this horrifying realization dawned on him, Aldous heard footsteps approaching. He quickly ducked behind a stack of empty sacks, his heart pounding in his ears. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Thomas entered the mill, carrying another large sack. He moved with a grim determination, his face etched with a cold, unsettling resolve. He emptied the contents of the sack, more bones, into the chest beneath the millstone. Aldous knew he had to act now. He couldn't let Thomas continue this ujasne ritual. He couldn't let Helena become the next victim. He stepped out from behind the sacks, his blacksmith's hammer held firmly in his hand. "Thomas," he said, his voice low but firm. The miller spun around, his eyes widening in shock and then narrowing with fury. "Aldous, what are you doing here?" "I know your secret, Thomas," Aldous said, his gaze unwavering. "I know what you're doing with the mill." Thomas's face contorted with rage. You know nothing. Get out of here before you regret it. Where is Helena? Aldous demanded. What have you done to her? She's where she belongs, Thomas snarled, preparing for her purpose. A wave of fury washed over Aldous. He lunged at Thomas, swinging his hammer. The miller, though older, was strong. He dodged the blow and tackled Aldous, sending them both crashing to the dusty floor. A brutal struggle ensued, the two men grappling amidst the sacks of bones and the eerie glow of the millstone. Aldous, fueled by his love for Helena and his righteous anger, eventually gained the upper hand. He managed to pin Thomas to the ground, his hammer held threateningly above the miller's face. Tell me where Helena is, Aldous growled. Tell me how to stop this. Thomas, his face bruised and bleeding, finally relented. She's in the chamber below, he gasped. The ritual, it needs a willing sacrifice. Her mother, she wasn't willing at first. But Helena, she believes it's her duty. Aldous felt a fresh wave of horror wash over him. He had to save Helena, not just from her father, but from herself. He tied Thomas up with some rope he found nearby and then searched for the entrance to the chamber below. He found a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of grain sacks. Heaving it open, he descended into the darkness, the mournful whispers from the millstone growing louder as he went. The chamber below was small and damp, lit by a single flickering candle. In the center of the room, lying on a stone altar, was Helena. Her eyes were closed, and her face was pale and serene, as if she were asleep. Above her, directly beneath the millstone, was a strange, glowing symbol carved into the ceiling. Helena! Aldous cried, rushing to her side. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a gentle smile. Aldous, she whispered, you shouldn't be here. I'm here to take you away from this, he said, his voice filled with emotion. This isn't your duty, Helena. This is madness. Just then, the millstone above them began to spin faster, the whispers growing into anguished cries. The glowing symbol on the ceiling pulsed with an eerie light. It's starting, Helena said, her voice filled with a strange mix of fear and acceptance. You have to leave, Aldous. It's too late. But Aldous refused to leave her. He knew he had to break the connection between Helena and the millstone, between the living and the dead. He looked up at the glowing symbol, a desperate idea forming in his mind. He remembered the old tales, the stories of how such dark magic could be broken, often involving a sacrifice of pure intention. He looked at Helena, her beautiful face serene even in the face of impending doom. He knew what he had to do. With a heavy heart, Aldous made his choice. He would not let Helena suffer the same fate as her mother. He would find a way to break the curse, even if it cost him everything. The mill groaned above them, the whispers turned into wails, and the fate of the miller's daughter, and the young blacksmith who loved her, hung precariously in the balance. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the ancient stones of the mill seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what the dawn would bring. Story 2. The Minstrel's Last Song. The late autumn air carried a chill that bit through Lucian's worn leather jerkin as he urged his aging mare, Bess, along the winding path. For weeks, word of his skill had traveled ahead of him, carried on the whispers of villagers and the boasts of appreciative tavern keepers. His lute, a faithful companion for many years, rested securely across his back, its strings humming faintly in the breeze as if eager to sing. He had played for lords and ladies in grand halls, for common folk in smoky inns, and even once, for a reclusive hermit who offered him only a crust of bread and a cryptic warning about the dangers of singing too sweetly in shadowed places. But the invitation he now carried, sealed with the imposing crest of Count Ravencroft, was unlike any he had received before. Ravencroft Castle. The name itself conjured images of stark stone walls and windswept towers, perched precariously on some desolate peak. It was said to be a place of shadows and silence, a fortress more than a home, and stories whispered in hushed tones spoke of a lineage as old as the land itself, and perhaps, some said, just as unforgiving. No minstrel, as far as Lucian knew, had ever been invited to Ravencroft, let alone invited back. This singular honor, or perhaps oddity, had piqued his curiosity, and the generous purse promised for his services had certainly eased any initial apprehension. The journey had been long and arduous, taking him through dense forests where sunlight barely pierced the canopy, and across bleak moorlands where the wind howled like a banshee. As the day began to wane, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, the silhouette of the castle finally emerged on the horizon. It stood silhouetted against the fading light, a jagged crown of stone against the darkening sky, perched atop a craggy outcrop that seemed to defy gravity. Even from this distance, Lucian felt a prickle of unease. There was a starkness to the castle, an almost oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the sounds of the surrounding wilderness. As he drew closer, the sheer scale of Ravencroft became apparent. Towering walls of dark, unyielding stone rose hundreds of feet into the air, punctuated by narrow, slit-like windows that offered no hint of warmth or welcome. A heavy wooden gate, reinforced with iron bands, stood as the sole entry, flanked by two imposing guard towers that seemed to loom over him like silent sentinels. Lucian dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride, and led Bess forward, the rhythmic clop of her hooves echoing unervingly in the stillness. A lone figure stood by the gate, cloaked in black and holding a long, wickedly sharp halberd. He was gaunt and pale, his eyes like chips of flint as he scrutinized Lucian. "You are the minstrel?" His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "I am Lucian," he replied, offering a polite bow. "I have come at the invitation of Count Ravencroft." He presented the sealed letter, its wax seal bearing the unmistakable raven emblem. The guard broke the seal with a flick of his thumb and scanned the contents, his gaze lingering on the signature at the bottom. After a moment of silent appraisal, he nodded curtly. "Enter." The heavy gate creaked open, revealing a dimly lit courtyard paved with uneven stones. No welcoming party awaited him, no bustling servants or barking hounds. The silence here was even more profound, broken only by the rustling of the wind as it whistled through the battlements. Lucian led Bess across the courtyard, the sound of her hooves echoing against the cold stone walls. He noticed that the few torches flickering in iron sconces cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in the somber livery of the Ravencroft household. He was older, with a face etched with lines of worry, and his eyes held a weary resignation. "Welcome, Master Lucian," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am Elric, the Count's steward. Please follow me. I will see to your horse and then escort you to the Great Hall." Elric led Bess away, his movements slow and deliberate, while Lucian followed the steward into the castle itself. The interior was as stark and unwelcoming as the exterior. Stone corridors stretched into the gloom, lined with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and hunting, their colors faded and their threads worn with age. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something indefinable, that hinted at decay and forgotten things. They reached a massive oak door, its surface intricately carved with grotesque figures. Elric pushed it open, and Lucian stepped into the great hall. It was a vast chamber, its high vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. A massive fireplace dominated one end, though the fire burning within was surprisingly small, casting only a meager light that struggled to penetrate the oppressive darkness. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a raised dais, was Count Ravencroft. The Count was a man of imposing stature, though his frame was thin and his shoulders slightly stooped. His features were sharp and angular, his face pale and drawn, as if he rarely saw the light of day. His eyes, however, were piercing, dark and intense, and they fixed on Lucian with an unnerving intensity. He wore a long black velvet robe that seemed to absorb what little light there was, and a heavy silver chain hung around his neck, bearing a pendant shaped like a coiled serpent. "Welcome to Ravencroft, minstrel." The Count's voice was surprisingly resonant, echoing through the vast hall. "I have heard tales of your skill, and I am eager to hear your music." He gestured towards a small platform that had been set up near the fireplace. "Make yourself comfortable. Supper will be served shortly, and then I would be honored if you would entertain me." Lucian bowed respectfully. "It is my pleasure, Count Ravencroft. I am honored by your invitation." Supper was a somber affair. Lucian sat at a long, heavy wooden table with the Count and Elric. The food was simple but plentiful. Roasted fowl, coarse bread, and a thin, watery wine. Conversation was sparse, with the Count asking only a few perfunctory questions about Lucian's travels. Elric remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate, his movements stiff and mechanical. After the meal, the Count led Lucian back to the great hall. The fire had been replenished, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Lucian took his place on the platform, his lute in hand. He tuned the strings, the delicate notes echoing in the stillness. "Tell me, minstrel," the Count said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Do you know any ballads of sorrow? Tales of loss and despair, of darkness that consumes all light?" Lucian nodded. "I know many such tales, Count. Songs of tragic love, of brave heroes fallen, of the fleeting nature of joy." "Then let us begin with one of those," the Count said, leaning back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on Lucian. Lucian began to play, his fingers moving deftly across the strings of his lute. He sang a ballad of a young maiden who lost her love to the sea, her lament carried on the wind, a haunting melody of grief and longing. As he sang, he noticed something strange. The shadows in the hall seemed to deepen, to become more substantial, as if the very stone walls were absorbing the sorrow in his song. The flames in the fireplace flickered and danced, their light casting grotesque shapes on the tapestries. When he finished, the silence in the hall was profound. The Count remained still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "That was evocative, minstrel. You have a gift for weaving sorrow into song. For tonight, that is enough. You may retire to your chambers. We will speak again in the morning." Lucian was shown to a small, sparsely furnished room in one of the castle's towers. The bed was hard, the air cold and damp, but he was weary from his journey and soon fell asleep, the haunting melody of his ballad still echoing in his mind. The next evening, after another silent supper, the Count's requests grew darker. He asked for tales of betrayal and revenge, of madness and despair. Lucian obliged, drawing upon the vast repertoire of songs he had learned over the years. He sang of kings driven to madness by their own ambition, of lovers who turned on each other in fits of jealous rage, of plagues that swept through the land, leaving only death and desolation in their wake. Again, he noticed the strange reaction of the castle to his music. As he sang of treachery, the iron sconces holding the torches seemed to groan, and the flames within burned with a sickly green hue. When his ballad spoke of death, a cold draught swept through the hall, extinguishing several of the torches and plunging parts of the room into darkness. The Count watched him intently, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, a strange smile playing on his lips. On the third night, the Count's request was the darkest yet. "Minstrel," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "tonight, I wish to hear a song of ancient evil, a ballad of the things that lie hidden beneath the world, the forgotten horrors that sleep in the darkness." Lucian hesitated. He knew many such songs, tales whispered in secret corners, legends that spoke of primordial beings and unspeakable rituals. These were not songs meant for polite company, not melodies to be sung lightly. But the Count's gaze was insistent, his dark eyes holding a strange, almost feverish intensity. He began to sing, his voice low and resonant, telling a tale of a great serpent that slumbered beneath the mountains, its coils wrapped around the very foundations of the world. He sang of the ancient pact made with this creature, a bargain struck in darkness and fear, and of the terrible price that had to be paid to keep it appeased. As he sang, the castle seemed to tremble. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the earth, a sound that vibrated through the very stones beneath his feet. The tapestries on the walls began to sway. Even though there was no breeze, and dust rained down from the high vaulted ceiling. The Count watched him, his face pale but his eyes blazing with an unholy light. Lucian felt a growing unease, a sense that he was treading on dangerous ground. His music, it seemed, was not merely entertaining the Count. It was doing something else, something far more profound and unsettling. The air in the great hall grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy, and Lucian couldn't shake the feeling that with each note he played, he was drawing closer to something ancient and terrible that lay sleeping beneath Ravencroft Castle. The next day, Lucian awoke with a lingering sense of unease. The cold stone walls of his chamber seemed to press in on him, and the silence of the castle felt heavier, more oppressive than before. He ate a solitary breakfast of stale bread and cheese, brought to his room by a silent, pale-faced servant who offered no greeting and quickly disappeared. Feeling restless, Lucian decided to explore the castle. He wandered through echoing corridors, his footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness. He passed through grand chambers filled with dusty furniture draped in cloths, their portraits staring blankly from beneath protective coverings. He found a library, its shelves lined with ancient tomes bound in cracked leather, their titles hinting at forgotten lore and forbidden knowledge. He even ventured down into the castle's cellars, a labyrinth of damp, musty passages where the air hung thick and still, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water and the skittering of unseen creatures. Everywhere he went, there was a sense of age and decay, a feeling that the castle was slowly crumbling in on itself, harboring secrets best left undisturbed. As dusk began to settle, Lucian made his way back to the great hall. The Count was already there, seated in his usual place by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Elric stood silently to one side, his face ashen and drawn. "Minstrel," the Count said, his voice low and expectant, "tonight, I wish to hear more of the ancient serpent. Tell me of the pact, of the price that was paid." Lucian felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He had never sung that particular ballad in its entirety before. It was a long and disturbing tale, filled with dark omens and gruesome details. But the Count's request was insistent, and Lucian knew it was not his place to refuse. He began to play, his fingers moving across the lute strings with a hesitant touch. He sang of the first Ravencroft, a lord of immense power and ambition, who had sought to bind the ancient serpent to his will, to harness its power for his own gain. He told of the dark ritual performed in the dead of night, deep within the earth beneath the castle, and of the terrible bargain that was struck. The serpent would lend its power to the Ravencroft line, ensuring their dominion over the land, but in return, it would demand a sacrifice, a tribute of darkness and despair, to be paid every generation. As Lucian sang of the sacrifice, a sudden gust of wind swept through the great hall, extinguishing most of the torches and plunging the room into near darkness. The remaining flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. A low, rumbling sound echoed from beneath the castle, louder and more menacing than the night before. Even Elric, who had remained impassive throughout Lucian's previous performances, flinched visibly, his eyes wide with fear. The Count, however, remained unmoved. His eyes gleamed in the flickering firelight, his lips curled into a strange, almost ecstatic smile. "Yes," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rumbling. "Yes, that is it. Tell me more, minstrel. Tell me of the price." Lucian continued his ballad, his voice growing stronger despite the tremor that ran through his hands. He sang of the increasing demands of the serpent over the centuries, of the darkness that had slowly crept into the Ravencroft line, twisting their minds and corrupting their souls. He told of the despair that had settled over the castle, a palpable weight that seemed to cling to the very stones, and of the strange occurrences that had plagued the Ravencroft family for generations. Unexplained illnesses, sudden deaths, and whispers of madness in the halls. As he reached the climax of the ballad, describing the ultimate sacrifice that would be required to fully awaken the serpent, the castle seemed to convulse. The walls groaned, and cracks appeared in the stone. A section of the ceiling above them crumbled, sending a shower of dust and debris crashing to the floor. The The remaining torches were extinguished, plunging the great hall into complete darkness. A blood-curdling scream echoed from somewhere deep within the castle, followed by a sickening thud. Lucian stopped playing, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He could feel the Count's gaze on him in the darkness, an unseen presence that sent a shiver down his spine. After a long, terrifying moment, the Count spoke, his voice calm and even, as if nothing untoward had happened. "An enthusiastic performance, minstrel. You have a remarkable talent for bringing these old tales to life." There was a strange note in his voice, a hint of something dark and triumphant. Torches were relit by unseen hands, revealing the extent of the damage to the great hall. The air was thick with dust, and a large pile of rubble lay on the floor where the ceiling had collapsed. Elric was gone. Lucian looked around, his eyes searching for the steward, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Do not concern yourself with Elric," the Count said, his gaze following Lucian's. "He has retired for the evening." His smile did not reach his eyes. "For tonight, minstrel, you have done well. But tomorrow night, I will have need of a different song. A final song." Lucian's blood ran cold. He looked at the Count, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a lonely nobleman seeking entertainment, but something far more sinister. There was a hunger in his eyes, a desperate yearning that spoke of dark intentions. The pieces began to fall into place. The isolation of the castle, the Count's obsession with dark ballads, the strange reactions of the castle to his music. It was as if the very fabric of the place was resonating with the evil he sang of, growing stronger with each note. He thought back to the hermit's cryptic warning, "Beware of singing too sweetly in shadowed places." He finally understood. His music was not merely entertainment. It was a key, unlocking something ancient and terrible that lay dormant beneath Ravencroft Castle. And Count Ravencroft intended him to play the final note. Sleep offered little respite that night. Lucian tossed and turned on the hard mattress, his mind racing with the horrifying implications of the Count's words. He was a pawn in some ancient, terrible game, his music a tool to awaken a malevolent entity. He had to escape, but the castle felt like a prison, its walls looming and unforgiving. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale hues of gray and pink, Lucian resolved to find a way out. He crept from his room, his lute clutched tightly in his hand, and moved silently through the deserted corridors. He tried every door he could find, but they were all locked or heavily barred. The few servants he encountered were gaunt and silent, their eyes downcast, offering no help or even acknowledgement of his presence. They seemed more like ghosts haunting the castle than living beings. He eventually found himself back in the library. Perhaps, amongst the dusty tomes, he could find some clue, some forgotten lore that might explain the nature of the serpent and the Count's intentions. He spent hours poring over the ancient texts, his fingers tracing the faded script. He found passages that spoke of ancient beings of immense power, slumbering beneath the earth, and of the rituals used to appease or awaken them. He discovered fragmented accounts of the Ravencroft family history, tales of dark bargains and terrible consequences. One particularly old and brittle book, bound in what appeared to be human skin, contained a detailed description of the ritual to fully awaken the serpent. It spoke of a final song, a melody of pure darkness and despair, that would shatter the ancient wards that had kept the creature dormant for centuries. The book even contained a few lines of the song itself, written in a language Lucian did not recognize, but the very sight of the symbols sent a shiver of dread down his spine. He now understood the Count's plan. He had invited Lucian to the castle not for mere entertainment, but to be the instrument of this terrifying ritual. The darker ballads he had requested each night had been weakening the ancient wards, preparing the way for the final song. And tonight, Lucian was meant to play that song, unleashing whatever horror lay chained beneath Ravencroft Castle. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find a way to stop this, to prevent the unleashing of such an evil. But what could a simple minstrel do against an ancient pact and a mad count? As dusk approached, a heavy dread settled over the castle. Lucian knew that this was the final night. He could feel it in the air, in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the castle. He made his way to the great hall, his heart heavy with foreboding. The Count was already there, standing before the fireplace, his back to Lucian. He was dressed in a long black robe, and the silver serpent pendant around his neck seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. Elric was not present. "Minstrel," the Count said, turning to face Lucian, his eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity. "Tonight is the night. Tonight you will play the final song." He held out a small, rolled-up piece of parchment. "Here are the words." Lucian took the parchment, his hand trembling slightly. The symbols on it were the same as those in the ancient book, radiating an aura of cold, malevolent power. He looked at the Count, his gaze filled with defiance. "I will not play this song," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I will not be a part of your dark ritual." A cruel smile spread across the Count's face. "You have no choice, minstrel. The wards are weak. The serpent stirs. If you do not play the song, it will awaken anyway, and its wrath will be terrible. But if you play it willingly, perhaps it will spare you." Lucian knew the Count was lying. No one would be spared if such an entity were unleashed upon the world. He had to find another way. As the Count gestured towards the platform, Lucian suddenly began to play his lute. But instead of the dark, despairing melody the Count expected, he played a bright, vibrant tune, a song of hope and resilience, a melody filled with the warmth of the sun and the strength of life. It was a song he had learned as a boy, a simple folk tune that celebrated the beauty of the world and the enduring spirit of humanity. The Count recoiled as if struck. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Stop! Play the song." But Lucian continued to play, his fingers moving furiously across the strings, pouring all his hope and defiance into the music. As the joyful melody filled the great hall, a strange thing began to happen. The shadows seemed to recede, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a faint light began to emanate from the ancient stones of the castle. The Count screamed in rage, lunging towards Lucian. But as he did, the silver serpent pendant around his neck began to glow with an intense, malevolent light. The serpent's eyes, made of dark, glittering stones, seemed to fix on the Count, and a low, guttural growl echoed from within the pendant. The Count staggered back, clutching at his chest. The light from the pendant intensified, and the growling grew louder, more menacing. Then, with a final, agonizing scream, the Count collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing violently. The light from the pendant faded, and the growling ceased. Lucian stopped playing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the Count's still form, a mixture of fear and relief washing over him. He had defied the darkness, and somehow he had survived. But as he looked around the great hall, he noticed something else. The cracks in the walls had begun to close, the rubble on the floor had vanished, and the torches burned with a clear, steady flame. The castle seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from its ancient stones. He knew then that the ancient wards had not been entirely broken. His dark ballads had weakened them, but his song of hope had somehow rekindled their power, turning the serpent's own magic against its intended master. As dawn broke, casting a golden light through the narrow windows of the great hall, Lucian made his way out of Ravencroft Castle. He left behind the silent servants and the fallen Count, carrying with him the memory of the darkness he had faced and the power of hope that had saved him. He did not look back as he urged Bess down the winding path, away from the imposing silhouette of the castle against the rising sun. He knew that he would never forget the minstrel's last song played within those shadowed walls, a song that had not unleashed horror, but had instead, perhaps, kept it at bay, for now. The world outside Ravencroft felt brighter, lighter, and as he journeyed on, the melody of hope echoed in his heart, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, a single spark of light can make all the difference. He couldn't shake the feeling, however, that the serpent still slumbered beneath the earth, and that one day, another song might awaken it once more. Story 3. The Prioress's Secret. The iron gates of St. Ursula's convent creaked open with a groan that echoed through the crisp autumn air, a sound that Sister Margaret found both welcoming and faintly ominous. She clutched the small bundle containing her few earthly possessions, her heart aflutter with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The journey from her village had been long and arduous, but the promise of learning the sacred art of illumination had spurred her onward. St. Ursula's was renowned throughout the region for its exquisite manuscripts, particularly a psalter whose colors were said to shimmer with an otherworldly brilliance. It was this psalter, more than anything, that had drawn Margaret to these remote, mist-shrouded hills. Mother Agnes, the prioress, greeted her at the threshold with a serene smile that did little to ease Margaret's nervousness. The prioress was a woman of striking presence, her eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see straight through Margaret's modest exterior. Her demeanor was one of quiet authority, and the other sisters moved with a hushed reverence in her presence. Margaret was led through a series of stone corridors, their walls adorned with faded tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of saints. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and incense, a fragrance that spoke of devotion and ancient rituals. Her initial days at the convent were filled with instruction in the basics of monastic life. She learned the rhythm of prayer, the importance of silence, and the simple routines that governed the sisters' days. Margaret found a quiet solace in the structured existence, a welcome change from the often chaotic life of her village. She assisted in the kitchens, tended the small herb garden, and spent hours in the scriptorium, carefully preparing parchment for the more experienced sisters. It was in the scriptorium that Margaret first witnessed the painstaking process of illumination. She watched, mesmerized, as Sister Cecilia meticulously applied delicate strokes of gold leaf to the page, bringing to life intricate depictions of biblical scenes. The other sisters, each with their own unique skill, worked with a quiet dedication that Margaret found inspiring. She longed to join their ranks, to learn the secrets of their craft, and contribute to the creation of these beautiful and sacred objects. Mother Agnes, it seemed, had taken a particular interest in Margaret's progress. She would often visit the scriptorium, observing Margaret's tentative attempts at calligraphy and offering gentle guidance. The prioress praised Margaret's steady hand and keen eye, encouraging her to persevere in her studies. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for the prioress's attention, viewing it as a sign of her potential to truly excel in this art. As Margaret's skills improved, she was gradually entrusted with more complex tasks. She learned to grind pigments from various minerals and plants, marveling at the vibrant hues that could be coaxed from seemingly ordinary materials. She practiced the delicate art of applying these pigments to the parchment, slowly developing the precision and control required for intricate designs. Yet, despite her growing proficiency, the legendary psalter remained elusive. The psalter was kept locked away in a private chamber, accessible only to Mother Agnes. The other sisters spoke of it in hushed tones, their descriptions painting a picture of unparalleled beauty. They whispered of colors that seemed to glow from within, of intricate details that revealed new wonders with each viewing. Margaret's curiosity grew with each passing day, her desire to see this masterpiece becoming an almost constant preoccupation. One afternoon, while assisting Sister Agnes, an older nun known for her extensive knowledge of the convent's history, Margaret tentatively inquired about the psalter. Sister Agnes's usual cheerful demeanor seemed to cloud over at the mention of the book. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting nervously around the scriptorium before leaning in close to Margaret. "The psalter is special, child," she said in a low voice. "Its colors are unlike anything you have ever seen, but it is not for our eyes, not yet. Mother Agnes keeps it safe, and we must trust in her wisdom." Margaret sensed a strange unease in Sister Agnes's words, a hint of something unspoken that lingered in the air. She pressed gently, her curiosity piqued. "But why is it kept so secret, sister? Surely such a beautiful work should be shared, should inspire us all." Sister Agnes sighed, her gaze distant. "There are things we do not understand, child. Some knowledge is best left undisturbed. It is enough for us to know that the psalter exists, a testament to the glory of God." With that, she turned back to her work, effectively ending the conversation. Margaret was left with a lingering sense of unease. Sister Agnes's reaction had been unexpected, and it only served to deepen the mystery surrounding the Psalter. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she had been told. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret continued her training, her skills steadily improving. She became adept at preparing the vellum, sketching the initial designs, and applying the base colors. Yet, the vibrant, almost luminous hues that characterized the legendary Psalter remained beyond her reach. The other sisters used pigments of rich blues, deep reds, and vibrant greens, but none possessed the unique brilliance that was rumored to adorn the hidden manuscript. Margaret noticed that a particular shade of crimson was never used in the scriptorium. It was said to be reserved for the most sacred of texts, a color known only as angel's crimson. She had heard whispers among the younger novices that this pigment was incredibly rare and difficult to obtain, but no one seemed to know its true source. One evening, as Margaret was tidying the scriptorium after the other sisters had retired for the night, she noticed a small, locked chest tucked away in a corner. It was an ornate box, crafted from dark wood and inlaid with silver. Curiosity overcoming her better judgment, Margaret approached the chest. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface, wondering what treasures it might contain. Suddenly, she heard the soft rustle of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Mother Agnes standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the single flickering candle. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. She stammered an apology, explaining that she had simply been tidying up. The prioress's gaze was piercing, her blue eyes seeming to bore into Margaret's very soul. "Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, Sister Margaret," she said, her voice low and measured. "Some secrets are best left undisturbed. You would do well to remember that." Margaret lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning with shame. She mumbled her understanding, promising that it would not happen again. Mother Agnes continued to watch her for a long moment before finally turning and silently leaving the scriptorium. The encounter left Margaret deeply unsettled. The prioress's words, coupled with Sister Agnes's earlier unease, fueled her growing suspicion that something was amiss within the walls of St. Ursula's. The legendary Psalter, the secret chamber, the mysterious angel's crimson. All these pieces seemed to fit together, forming a puzzle that Margaret felt compelled to solve. The allure of the illuminated manuscripts had brought her to this place, but now, a different kind of quest had begun, a quest for truth in the shadowed corners of the convent. The unease that settled over Margaret that night in the scriptorium lingered in the following days. She found herself observing the other sisters more closely, noticing subtle nuances in their behavior that she had previously overlooked. There was a quiet sadness in the eyes of some of the older nuns, a weariness that seemed to go beyond the demands of their daily routines. The younger novices, in particular, seemed to carry a palpable air of fear, their voices often hushed, their movements quick and furtive. Margaret recalled the stories she had heard in the village about St. Ursula's. While the convent was celebrated for its artistry, there were also whispers, dark and unsettling, of novices who had entered its walls and were never seen again. These rumors had always been dismissed as superstitious nonsense, the product of fearful imaginations. But now, within the convent's imposing stone walls, these whispers took on a new, disturbing resonance. She began to discreetly inquire about the novices who had arrived at St. Ursula's before her. She would casually mention their names, feigning curiosity about their progress in their religious studies or their artistic training. The responses she received were vague and evasive. Some sisters claimed not to remember them, while others offered brief, dismissive explanations about them being transferred to other convents or having succumbed to illness. None of the explanations felt entirely convincing to Margaret. One name in particular kept surfacing in her thoughts: Sister Agnes, the older nun who had spoken to her about the Psalter. Margaret had noticed that Sister Agnes had not been seen in the scriptorium or at meals for several days. When Margaret inquired about her well-being, she was met with the same vague responses as before. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the very sister who had hinted at the convent's secrets had now seemingly vanished. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Margaret decided to try and learn more about the angel's crimson, the mysterious pigment that was never used in the regular illuminations. She spent hours poring over the convent's library, searching through ancient texts on pigments and dyes. She found numerous references to various shades of red, derived from minerals, plants, and even insects, but none matched the description of the uniquely vibrant angel's crimson. One particularly old and leather-bound volume, tucked away on a dusty shelf, caught her eye. Its pages were brittle and yellowed with age, its script faded and difficult to decipher. With painstaking effort, Margaret began to translate the ancient text. It spoke of alchemical processes, of rare and precious ingredients used to create pigments of extraordinary brilliance. And then her blood ran cold as she came across a passage that described a crimson dye, a color of unparalleled vibrancy, said to be derived from a source most pure and willingly given. The text was cryptic and veiled, but the implication sent a wave of nausea through Margaret. Could it be? Could the legendary angel's crimson be something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined? The thought was so horrifying that she initially tried to dismiss it as a product of her overactive imagination. But the unease she had felt since her arrival at the convent, the evasive answers, the missing novices, Sister Agnes's disappearance, it all seemed to point towards a dark and terrible secret hidden within these hallowed walls. Margaret knew she had to uncover the truth, no matter how frightening it might be. The thought of the beautiful psalter, its pages adorned with this mysterious crimson, now filled her with a sense of profound revulsion. She resolved to find the locked chamber where the psalter was kept and to discover the source of its unearthly colors. Her opportunity came a few nights later. The convent was shrouded in an unusual silence, even for the late hour. A thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the surrounding hills and muffling any sounds from the outside world. Margaret slipped out of her cell, her heart pounding in her chest. The corridors were dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like restless spirits. She made her way towards the prioress's private chambers, the location where she believed the psalter was kept. The door was made of heavy oak, secured by a sturdy lock. Margaret had no key, but she had spent enough time observing the prioress to know her habits. She knew that Mother Agnes often left the scriptorium door slightly ajar when she worked late into the night. Perhaps, just perhaps, the prioress had been similarly careless tonight. With trembling hands, Margaret tried the handle. To her surprise, it turned silently. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, peering into the room. The chamber was small and sparsely furnished, containing only a simple wooden desk, a chair, and a large, locked chest. This had to be it. Margaret's gaze fell upon the chest. It was the same ornate box she had seen in the scriptorium, the one that Mother Agnes had so fiercely guarded. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached it. The lock looked intricate, but Margaret had spent countless hours studying the fine details of illuminated manuscripts. She had a knack for discerning patterns and mechanisms. After a few tense moments, manipulating the delicate latch with a small hairpin she had managed to procure, she heard a soft click. The lock had sprung. Slowly, carefully, Margaret lifted the heavy lid of the chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet cloth, lay the psalter. It was even more breathtaking than the rumors had suggested. The pages were made of the finest vellum, and the script was executed with exquisite precision. But it was the colors that truly captivated her. They seemed to glow with an inner light, particularly the crimson, which possessed a vibrancy that was almost unsettling. It pulsed with a life of its own, drawing her gaze into its depths. As she reached out a trembling finger to touch the crimson ink, she noticed something else in the chest, tucked away beneath the psalter. It was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with elegant, looping script, the handwriting unmistakably that of Mother Agnes. Margaret hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She knew that reading the prioress's private journal was a grave transgression, but her desire to uncover the truth outweighed her fear of the consequences. With a deep breath, she opened the journal and began to read. The words on the page chilled her to the bone. They spoke of an ancient tradition within the convent, a dark secret passed down from prioress to prioress for generations. The vibrant angel's crimson, the journal revealed, was not derived from any mineral or plant. It was made from blood, the blood of the purest and most innocent among them, willingly offered as a sacrifice to create the most sacred of texts. And the journal went on to describe the meticulous process of the harvesting, the rituals involved, and the profound sense of purpose that the prioress and her predecessors had felt in creating these magnificent works. Margaret's mind reeled in horror. The beauty of the Psalter now seemed grotesque, its vibrant colors stained with the blood of innocent lives. And then, she read a passage that made her blood run cold. Mother Agnes had written of a new source, a young novice with a remarkable purity of spirit and a natural talent for illumination. A novice who had arrived at the convent just a few months ago. A novice named Margaret. A sudden sound from the hallway outside the chamber jolted Margaret back to reality. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were approaching. Mother Agnes. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She had to get out, to warn the others, to escape this place of unimaginable horror. She quickly placed the journal back in the chest, closed the lid, and silently slipped out of the chamber, just as the prioress's shadow fell across the threshold. The encounter in the scriptorium, the subtle questions, the late-night visit to the private chamber, it all painted a clear picture for Mother Agnes. The prioress knew, and Margaret knew her time at St. Ursula's was drawing to a terrifying close. Margaret fled down the darkened corridor, her breath catching in her throat. The heavy footsteps of Mother Agnes echoed behind her, growing closer with each frantic stride. She knew the convent's layout well enough to understand that escape through the main gates was impossible. The prioress would surely have alerted the other sisters, and the massive iron doors would be bolted shut. Her only hope lay in the network of hidden passages and forgotten chambers that snaked beneath the convent. She had overheard whispers among the older nuns about these secret routes, tales of how they had been used in times of trouble centuries ago. If she could find one of these hidden entrances, she might have a chance. She veered sharply to the right, down a narrow passage that led towards the oldest part of the convent. The air here was thick with the smell of damp stone and mildew, and the silence was heavy and oppressive. She could still hear the prioress's relentless pursuit, the rhythmic thud of her footsteps, a terrifying drumbeat in the stillness. Suddenly, she spotted a faint glimmer of light emanating from beneath a heavy tapestry hanging on the wall. She hesitated for only a moment before pulling the tapestry aside. Behind it, concealed in the shadows, was a narrow doorway, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. Without a second thought, she slipped through the opening and into the darkness beyond. The passage was narrow and winding, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Margaret stumbled blindly forward, her hands outstretched to feel her way along the cold, rough stone walls. The prioress's footsteps had faded behind her, replaced by an unnerving silence. She could only hope that she had managed to lose her pursuer. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger chamber. A single flickering torch cast eerie shadows on the walls, revealing a scene that made Margaret's stomach churn. This was the harvesting chamber. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained with dark, dried blood. Above it, a series of sharp, silver instruments glinted in the torchlight. Along one wall, Margaret saw rows of empty vats, their interiors bearing the same gruesome stains as the altar. And in the corner, stacked neatly like firewood, were bundles of what she recognized with a sickening lurch as human hair, each tied with a ribbon in a different shade. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The missing novices, Sister Agnes's disappearance, the rumors of the convent's dark past. It all came together in this horrifying tableau. This was where they had been brought, their blood willingly or unwillingly given to create the precious angel's crimson. As Margaret stood frozen in horror, she heard a soft sound behind her. She whirled around to see Mother Agnes standing in the doorway, a serene smile on her face. In her hand, she held a small silver chalice, its surface gleaming in the torchlight. "Welcome, Sister Margaret," the prioress said, her voice calm and gentle, as if she were welcoming a guest to a simple meal. "I knew you would find your way here eventually. You possess a rare curiosity, a thirst for knowledge that is both admirable and inconvenient." Margaret stood speechless, her mind reeling from the horrifying truth she had uncovered. She could see a chilling determination in the prioress's eyes, a fanatic devotion to this gruesome tradition. "You understand now, don't you?" Mother Agnes continued, taking a step closer. "The beauty, the sanctity, the power of our illuminated texts. They are made sacred by the very essence of purity. And you, my dear Margaret, you possess such a pure essence." Margaret finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. This is madness. You're killing innocent people." The prioress's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "They are not dying, child. They are transcending. Their essence becomes part of something eternal, something divine. They contribute to the glory of God in a way that few others can." Margaret knew that there was no reasoning with this woman. Her mind was twisted by centuries of tradition and a terrifying sense of righteousness. Her only chance was to escape. As the prioress took another step forward, Margaret made her move. She lunged to the side, knocking over a stack of empty vats, the clatter echoing loudly through the chamber. Before Mother Agnes could react, Margaret sprinted towards the doorway, hoping to make it back to the hidden passage. But the prioress was surprisingly swift. She moved with a speed that belied her age, intercepting Margaret just as she reached the doorway. Margaret cried out as the prioress grabbed her arm, her grip like iron. "You cannot leave, Margaret," she said, her voice now laced with a chilling urgency. "Your destiny lies here. You are meant to be part of this sacred work." A struggle ensued, a desperate fight for survival in the dimly lit chamber. Margaret fought with all her strength, fueled by a primal fear and a burning desire to live. She managed to break free from the prioress's grasp for a moment, scrambling towards the altar. She grabbed one of the sharp silver instruments, its cold surface offering a sliver of hope. But Mother Agnes was relentless. She lunged again, tackling Margaret to the ground. The silver instrument clattered away, lost in the shadows. The prioress pinned Margaret down, her eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "It is time, child," she whispered, her voice strangely gentle. "Time for you to become part of the eternal beauty." Margaret closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But then, a sudden sound pierced the silence. A blood-curdling scream, followed by a heavy thud. Margaret cautiously opened her eyes. Mother Agnes lay motionless beside her, a dark stain spreading across her pristine white robes. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, was Sister Cecilia, the gentle illuminator who had first shown Margaret the beauty of gold leaf. In her trembling hand, she held a heavy iron candlestick. I couldn't let her," Sister Cecilia stammered, her voice choked with emotion. "I knew, I suspected, but I didn't want to believe it. Not until I saw the journal." Together, Margaret and Sister Cecilia fled the harvesting chamber, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and relief. They made their way through the hidden passages, eventually emerging into the cold night air, far from the walls of St. Ursula's. They never looked back. The convent remained shrouded in its secrets, a silent testament to the darkness that had festered within its holy walls. The tale of the prioress's secret would forever haunt Margaret's dreams, a chilling reminder of the beauty that could be born from unimaginable cruelty. The vibrant hues of illuminated manuscripts would never look quite the same to her again, forever tinged with the color of blood. And though she had escaped the convent, a part of her remained trapped within its stone walls, forever marked by the horrifying truth she had uncovered. The whispers of the wind through the desolate hills seemed to carry a faint echo of the screams, a haunting melody that lingered long after the convent had faded from view. Story 4. The Falconer's Birds. Roland had served Lord Auberon for the better part of 20 years. His life intertwined with the soaring cries and vibrant plumage of the Lord's extraordinary collection of birds. Auberon Castle, perched precariously on a craggy outcrop overlooking the whispering woods, was a place of both beauty and unsettling quiet. The Lord, a man consumed by his singular passion, rarely entertained visitors and preferred the company of his feathered companions to that of his own kind. Roland, a man of quiet observation and unwavering loyalty, understood this peculiar existence, finding a certain peace in the predictable rhythm of caring for the aviary. He knew each bird by its markings, its calls, its individual temperament. There were peregrine falcons with eyes like chips of obsidian, their dives swift and deadly, majestic eagles whose wings spanned the length of a man's arm, and delicate songbirds whose melodies filled the castle courtyard with fleeting moments of joy. Then came the ravens, sleek and intelligent, their plumage the color of a moonless night. They possessed an uncanny awareness, their dark eyes seeming to hold ancient secrets. Lord Auberon had a particular fondness for them, often spending hours in their company, whispering words that Roland could never quite decipher. It was a solitary life, punctuated only by the comings and goings of the few other servants. Agnes, the cook, her face etched with a permanent weariness. Thomas, the stable hand, a burly man whose laughter had long since faded. And young Alara, the scullery maid, her eyes wide and often filled with a nameless apprehension. They moved through the castle like shadows, their interactions with the Lord minimal, their lives revolving around the upkeep of the imposing stone structure and the fulfillment of his increasingly eccentric requests. One crisp autumn morning, a heavily guarded cart arrived at the castle gates. Roland, alerted by the unusual commotion, watched as two burly men, their faces grim and their movements furtive, carefully unloaded several large, covered cages. The air around the cages hummed with an unfamiliar energy, a palpable tension that prickled Roland's skin. He approached cautiously as Lord Auberon. His usually pale face flushed with excitement, supervised the unloading. The Lord's thin, elegant fingers trembled slightly as he gestured towards the largest cage. "Roland," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "behold my latest acquisitions, birds unlike any you have ever seen." With a flourish, the Lord unveiled the cage. Inside, perched on rough-hewn branches, were two birds of a size Roland had never encountered before. They were roughly the size of small dogs, their plumage a mottled gray and brown, blending almost seamlessly with the shadows within the cage. But it was their eyes that truly captivated and disturbed Roland. They were large, round, and a startling shade of amber, almost golden in the dim light. And they possessed an unsettling quality, an unnerving intelligence that seemed to peer directly into Roland's soul. They were undeniably human-like, not merely in their shape or color, but in their depth, their seeming capacity for thought and emotion. A shiver ran down Roland's spine despite himself. Lord Auberon, oblivious to Roland's unease, was ecstatic. He circled the cage, murmuring praises to the strange creatures. "They come from the east," he explained, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "A land of wonders and curiosities. They are said to possess unique abilities." He didn't elaborate, but the cryptic words hung heavy in the air. Roland couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. These were not creatures to be kept caged. There was an aura of wildness, of something ancient and untamed about them that made him deeply uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, Roland observed the new birds with a growing sense of unease. They remained mostly silent, their large, intelligent eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They ate voraciously, consuming the raw meat that Thomas delivered each morning with an almost unnatural eagerness. Roland noticed that Lord Auberon spent an increasing amount of time with them, often sitting for hours in their aviary, simply watching them. The other servants, too, seemed drawn to the new arrivals, though their reactions were different. Agnes would hurry past their cages, muttering prayers under her breath. Thomas avoided the aviary altogether, claiming the birds gave him the creeps. Only Alara seemed unafraid, occasionally lingering near their cage, her young face a mixture of curiosity and something Roland couldn't quite decipher. It was around this time that Roland began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of the other servants. Agnes, usually a woman of sharp words and brisk movements, became strangely docile. She would perform her chores with a vacant expression, her eyes unfocused, her movements slow and almost robotic. Thomas, the once jovial stable hand, grew withdrawn and silent. He would tend to the horses with a grim determination, never meeting Roland's gaze, his responses to questions clipped and monosyllabic. Even Alara seemed different. The spark of youthful curiosity in her eyes had been replaced by a blank stare, and she moved through the castle with an unnerving stillness. At first, Roland dismissed these changes as mere coincidence, the result of the monotonous routine of castle life or perhaps some unspoken ailment. But as the days turned into weeks, the changes became more pronounced, more disturbing. The servants moved with a strange uniformity, their actions synchronized, their expressions devoid of any individual thought or emotion. It was as if they were puppets, their strings pulled by some unseen force. Roland watched them with growing alarm, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He tried to speak to Agnes, to ask her if she was feeling unwell, but her response was a blank stare and a mumbled, "I am as Lord Auburn wishes." The same vacant reply met his attempts to converse with Thomas and Alara. Lord Auburn, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the unsettling transformation of his household. He remained fixated on his new birds, his fascination bordering on obsession. He had moved their cages into a specially prepared chamber adjacent to his private study, a room that had always been kept locked and off-limits to the servants. Roland would occasionally see the Lord entering or leaving the chamber, his face alight with a strange, almost feverish intensity. He often carried small, intricately carved amulets, which he would clutch tightly in his hand. Roland had never seen the Lord wear such things before, and their sudden appearance only added to his growing unease. One evening, as dusk settled over the castle, Roland was tending to the Lord's prized hunting falcons. Their sharp eyes darted about their perches, their restless energy a stark contrast to the unsettling stillness that had permeated the rest of the castle. As he cleaned their enclosure, Roland glanced towards the window of Lord Auburn's study. The curtains were drawn, but a faint, flickering light emanated from within. He could hear the low, guttural cooing of the new birds, a sound that had become increasingly familiar and increasingly disturbing. Suddenly, the door to the study opened, and Roland saw Alara emerge. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on some unseen point in the distance. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her arms held stiffly at her sides. In her hands, she carried a large, bloodied tray. Roland's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the remnants on the tray, scraps of meat, undoubtedly. But there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the meat were fragments of bone, small and delicate, like those of a bird or a small animal. But something in their shape, their size, sent a wave of nausea crashing over him. They looked disturbingly like finger bones. Roland watched, frozen in place, as Alara glided silently down the corridor and disappeared into the shadows. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, to convince himself that his eyes had played tricks on him in the fading light. But the image of those small, chillingly familiar bones was seared into his mind. A terrible suspicion began to form, a horrifying realization that threatened to shatter the carefully constructed normalcy of his life at Auburn Castle. He looked back towards the window of the Lord's study, the flickering light now seeming to pulse with an ominous intensity. The low cooing of the birds echoed through the silent castle, no longer sounding like the gentle murmur of contented creatures, but more like a sinister, satisfied purr. Roland knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the arrival of these strange, human-eyed birds had brought something dark and malevolent to Auburn Castle, and that the unsettling changes he had witnessed were just the beginning of a far greater horror. He had to understand what was happening, not just for himself, but for the sake of the other servants, whose vacant eyes hinted at a fate far more terrifying than he could possibly imagine. the Lord's secretive behavior, the strange amulets, the bloodied tray. It all pointed to a truth that Roland dreaded to uncover. The sight of Alara carrying the bloodied tray haunted Roland's waking hours and invaded his restless sleep. He found himself constantly watching the other servants, his gaze lingering on their vacant eyes and their strangely synchronized movements. Agnes would now prepare meals with an almost mechanical precision, her once lively chatter replaced by an unsettling silence. Thomas tended to the stables with a grim focus, his interactions with the horses lacking their usual gentle touch. Even their footsteps seemed to echo through the castle in an unervingly uniform rhythm. Roland tried to find some semblance of their former selves, a flicker of recognition in their eyes, a spontaneous word or gesture, but found nothing. They were like automatons, their spirits seemingly leached away, leaving behind empty shells performing their duties with eerie obedience. His attention then turned to Lord Oberon. The Lord's already reclusive nature intensified. He spent almost all his time in the chamber with the new birds, emerging only for brief periods, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burning with a strange intensity. He often wore several of the intricately carved amulets now, not just one, and Roland noticed he would frequently touch them, as if seeking reassurance or protection. The Lord's meals, once taken in the Great Hall, were now brought to him in his private study. Agnes would deliver the trays, her usual complaints about his peculiar dietary requests absent. Roland observed that the trays returning from the study were always empty, cleaned with an almost disturbing thoroughness. He wondered what exactly the Lord was consuming in his self-imposed isolation. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Roland decided to investigate further. He started by trying to speak to the servants individually, choosing moments when they were alone, hoping to break through the strange apathy that enveloped them. He approached Agnes in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat that looked suspiciously pale and unfamiliar. "Agnes," he began, his voice gentle, "are you feeling all right? You seem different lately." Agnes stopped her work, her hands still holding a large carving knife. She turned to Roland, her eyes devoid of any expression. "I am as Lord Oberon wishes," she repeated, her voice flat and toneless. A shiver ran down Roland's spine. It was the same response he had received before, a phrase that offered no comfort and revealed nothing of her inner state. He tried again, asking about her family, about the garden she used to tend with such care, but her gaze remained blank, her only response the same chillingly obedient sentence. His attempts with Thomas in the stables met with similar results. The stable hand, once a man of boisterous laughter and tall tales, now moved with a heavy silence. When Roland asked him about the horses, about the new foal that had recently been born, Thomas simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the straw-covered floor. "Are you well, Thomas?" Roland pressed, placing a hand on his arm. Thomas flinched, pulling away as if burned. "I serve Lord Oberon," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The encounter left Roland feeling deeply unsettled. It was as if the very essence of the men and women he had known for years had been replaced by something cold and unfeeling. He even tried to speak to Alara, catching her in the scullery as she washed dishes with a slow, methodical precision. Her youthful face, usually bright and full of mischief, was now pale and gaunt, her eyes shadowed. "Alara," Roland said softly, kneeling beside her. "Is something troubling you?" The young girl stopped washing, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. She looked at Roland, her gaze unervingly direct, yet somehow distant. "The birds are hungry," she said, her voice a mere whisper, before resuming her task as if nothing had happened. The cryptic words sent a fresh wave of unease through Roland. The birds were always hungry, it seemed, their voracious appetites a constant demand on the household. But the way Alara had said it, with that strange, knowing look in her eyes, suggested something more sinister. Roland knew he had to find out what was happening within the locked chamber where the new birds were kept. He started spending more time near the study, listening for any sounds, watching for any clues. The only sounds he ever heard were the low, guttural cooing of the birds, and occasionally, the soft murmur of Lord Auburn's voice, too low to make out any words. The door to the chamber remained perpetually locked, and Roland knew better than to try and force it. Lord Auburn was a man of fierce temper, and any unauthorized intrusion would be met with severe consequences. One afternoon, however, Roland noticed something unusual. As Agnes carried a tray towards the Lord's study, Roland saw a small, intricately carved wooden amulet fall from her sleeve. It was identical to the ones Lord Auburn had been wearing. Agnes didn't seem to notice as she continued towards the study door. Roland quickly picked up the amulet. It was surprisingly light, made of a dark, polished wood, and etched with strange, unfamiliar symbols. As he held it in his hand, he felt a faint tingling sensation, a subtle vibration that seemed to hum beneath his skin. He quickly slipped the amulet into his pocket, a sense of both trepidation and determination filling him. This was a clue, a tangible piece of the puzzle. That night, under the cloak of darkness, Roland crept towards the Lord's study. The castle was silent. The only sound the gentle rustling of leaves outside the windows and the distant hoot of an owl. He pressed his ear against the study door, listening intently. He could hear the soft cooing of the birds, closer now, more insistent. And then he heard Lord Auburn's voice, speaking in a low, soothing tone. "My beautiful creatures," the Lord murmured. "Soon, you will have all you desire. Soon, the world will see your true glory." Roland strained to hear more, but the Lord's words were too soft, too indistinct. He then moved to the door of the adjacent chamber, the one where the new birds were kept. He pressed his ear against the cold stone, his heart pounding in his chest. The cooing was louder here, almost a soft, rhythmic chanting. And then he heard something else, a faint scraping sound, like claws on stone, followed by a soft, wet thud.
Roland S. Thomas Schörnd.
He imagined the scene within that locked room, the Lord, his strange birds, and the unsettling sounds that hinted at something unspeakable. As he stood there, listening in the darkness, a chilling realization dawned on Roland. The servants weren't merely unwell. They were being controlled. The vacant eyes, the synchronized movements, the chillingly obedient responses, it all pointed to some form of possession. And the new birds, with their unsettling human-like eyes and their voracious appetites, were somehow responsible. The bloodied tray, the bone fragments, the Lord's secretive behavior, the amulets, it all coalesced into a horrifying picture. Lord Auburn wasn't just collecting rare birds. He was using them for some dark, twisted purpose, and his own servants were the victims. He felt a surge of anger and a desperate need to intervene, to break the hold these creatures had on the people he had worked alongside for so many years. But he knew he had to be careful. He was just a falconer, and Lord Auburn held all the power within these stone walls. He needed to understand how the birds were controlling the servants, and what the Lord's ultimate plan was, before he could hope to stop it. The faint tingling sensation in his pocket, where he had placed Agnes's amulet, seemed to intensify, a subtle warning of the danger that lay ahead. He knew, with a growing certainty, that the answers he sought lay within that locked chamber, guarded by the unsettling gaze of the falconer's birds. The truth, he suspected, would be far more terrifying than anything he could currently imagine. A descent into a nightmare that would test the very limits of his courage and his sanity. The faint tingling in Roland's pocket, where Agnes's amulet rested, was a constant reminder of the unsettling truth he was beginning to piece together. He knew he couldn't confront Lord Auburn directly without more evidence, without understanding the nature of the bird's power and the purpose of the amulets. He needed to find a way into that locked chamber. Days turned into a tense waiting game. Roland continued his duties, his eyes constantly observing the Lord and the other servants, searching for any opportunity, any weakness in their strange, puppet-like existence. One morning, as Thomas was mucking out the stables, Roland noticed the stable hand's movements were slightly less precise than usual. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, perhaps confusion, perhaps even a hint of his old self, crossed Thomas's eyes before being replaced by the familiar blank stare. It was a small crack in the facade, but it gave Roland a sliver of hope. Perhaps the possession wasn't absolute. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of direct questions, he began to speak to the servants about their past, about shared memories, about the life they had before the arrival of the new birds. He spoke to Agnes about her late husband, the baker, and the delicious rye bread she used to bake. For a moment, her brow furrowed, and a faint shadow of sadness seemed to pass over her face. But then her eyes glazed over again, and she simply repeated her usual phrase. He talked to Thomas about the time they had gone hunting together years ago, and a brief smile touched the stable hand's lips before fading away. With Alara, he spoke of the wildflowers she used to gather in the meadows, and for a split second, her vacant gaze seemed to soften, a hint of longing in her eyes. These small, fleeting reactions, though brief, confirmed Roland's suspicion that some part of their former selves still lingered beneath the surface. His chance to uncover more came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Roland was tending to the Lord's hunting birds in the courtyard when he saw Lord Auberon leave his study. The Lord was in a state of agitation. His face flushed, his movements hurried. He barked orders at Thomas, instructing him to prepare his fastest horse immediately. As the Lord strode towards the stables, Roland noticed that the door to the chamber where the new birds were kept was slightly ajar. It was an oversight, a moment of carelessness on the Lord's part, but it was the opportunity Roland had been waiting for. His heart pounding, Roland slipped away from the courtyard and cautiously approached the study. He peered through the narrow opening in the chamber door. The sight that greeted him sent a wave of nausea and revulsion through him. Inside the dimly lit room, the two large birds were perched on a makeshift stand. Their amber eyes glowed with an unsettling intelligence as they watched him. The air was thick with a strange, musky odor. Scattered on the floor were more of the pale, fragmented bones he had seen on Alara's tray, along with scraps of what looked like human clothing. In the center of the room, on a low table, lay several more of the intricately carved amulets, identical to the one he had taken from Agnes and the ones Lord Auberon wore. As Roland's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he noticed something else. One of the birds was fixated on a drawing that lay open on the table. It was a detailed sketch of the castle and the surrounding lands, with several points marked with strange symbols. Roland recognized some of the locations: the village at the foot of the hill, the nearby monastery, even the small hunting lodge in the Whispering Woods. A terrifying realization began to dawn on him. Lord Auberon wasn't just controlling his own servants. His plans were far more extensive. Suddenly, one of the birds turned its gaze directly towards the crack in the door. Its amber eyes seemed to pierce through the wood, locking onto Roland's. He felt a strange sensation, a pressure behind his eyes, a subtle tugging at his thoughts. It was as if the bird was trying to reach into his mind, to exert some form of influence. He recoiled instinctively, stumbling back from the door. He understood then. The birds possessed humans through sustained eye contact. The amulets must offer some form of protection, perhaps disrupting the connection or blocking the bird's influence. And Lord Auberon had been feeding the birds his servants, keeping himself safe with the amulets while preparing for something far more sinister. He had to get out of there, to warn the villagers, to find a way to stop Lord Auberon before his dark plans could come to fruition. He turned to flee, but as he did, he heard a sound behind him. Lord Auberon stood in the doorway of his study, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with fury. In his hand, he held a small silver whistle. He blew a sharp, piercing note, a sound that echoed through the silent castle. Immediately, Roland heard the heavy footsteps of Thomas and Agnes approaching from different directions. Their eyes were blank, their movements swift and purposeful. He was trapped. Lord Auberon stepped forward, his voice dripping with menace. "So, you have been snooping, Roland. I had suspected your curiosity might get the better of you eventually." He gestured towards Thomas and Agnes. "See to him." Roland knew he couldn't fight them. They were under the bird's control, their strength enhanced by this unnatural influence. He had to think quickly. His eyes darted around the study, searching for any means of escape. He noticed a small window near the fireplace, partially obscured by heavy curtains. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. As Thomas and Agnes moved towards him, their hands reaching out, Roland made his move. He lunged towards the window, tearing aside the curtains and throwing himself through the narrow opening. He landed hard on the ground outside, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. He could hear Lord Auburn's furious shouts and the pounding footsteps of Thomas and Agnes behind him. He knew they would be relentless in their pursuit. He ran through the castle gardens, past the stables, and towards the dense, shadowy embrace of the whispering woods. He could feel their presence behind him, the chilling sensation of their vacant gazes fixed on his back. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached. The image of the birds' human-like eyes seared into his mind. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He had to find help, to warn the village, to somehow break the birds' hold on Lord Auburn's thralls. As he stumbled through the trees, the amulet he had taken from Agnes fell from his pocket. He picked it up, clutching it tightly in his hand. Perhaps this small piece of carved wood held the key to stopping the darkness that had descended upon Auburn Castle. He had witnessed the terrifying power of the falconer's birds, and he knew that if he failed, their influence would spread far beyond the walls of the castle, casting a long shadow over the land. The fate of the villagers, perhaps even the entire region, now rested on his weary shoulders. He had to find a way to expose Lord Auburn's monstrous secret and sever the connection between those unsettling eyes and the minds they had so cruelly enslaved. The whispers of the woods seemed to carry a warning, a sense of ancient dread that echoed the fear in Roland's own heart. He pressed on, driven by a desperate hope and the chilling knowledge of what awaited if he failed. Story 5. The Alchemist's Apprentice. The year is 1347. Isaac, no older than 12 summers, found himself plucked from the squalor of the London streets and thrust into a world of gleaming copper, bubbling concoctions, and the pervasive, peculiar scent of Master Cedric's laboratory. Cedric, a man whose reputation preceded him like the chiming of the royal herald, was the court alchemist, his name whispered with a mixture of awe and reverence. It was said he possessed the secrets to prolong life, a gift he bestowed upon the royal family, keeping them hale and hearty while plague and pestilence ravaged the common folk. For Isaac, a boy who had known only hunger and hardship, this apprenticeship was a miracle, a chance to escape the grim reality of his former existence. Master Cedric was an imposing figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. His hands, long and slender, moved with a delicate precision as he handled his alembics and retorts. He spoke little, his instructions concise and delivered in a low, resonant voice that commanded attention. Isaac was tasked with a variety of duties, from grinding rare herbs and minerals to meticulously cleaning the myriad of glass vessels that lined the laboratory shelves. The work was demanding, the hours long, but Isaac approached it with a diligent enthusiasm. He was eager to learn, to absorb the secrets that seemed to permeate the very air of the alchemist's workshop. The laboratory itself was a fascinating, albeit somewhat unsettling, place. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the stained glass windows, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. Shelves overflowed with strange ingredients, dried animal parts, oddly shaped stones, and jars filled with viscous liquids of varying hues. The air was thick with the mingled aromas of sulfur, herbs, and something else, something faintly metallic and indefinable, that sometimes made Isaac's stomach churn. In the center of the room stood a large brick furnace, its belly glowing with the heat of a constant fire, upon which sat various pieces of glassware, bubbling and steaming. In his initial weeks, Isaac found a strange sort of comfort in the routine. He rose before dawn, fetched water from the well, and prepared the laboratory for Master Cedric's work. He assisted in the preparation of various concoctions, carefully following the alchemist's instructions, his young mind trying to grasp the principles behind the seemingly magical transformations that took place within the glass vessels. He learned the names of exotic ingredients, dragon's blood, philosopher's stone, or so he was told the reddish powder was, and the elusive elixir vitae, the legendary life-extending potion that was the cornerstone of Master Cedric's renown. Master Cedric, while not unkind, maintained a strict distance. He rarely spoke of his personal life or his past, his focus solely on his work. He would occasionally quiz Isaac on the properties of different substances, his piercing gaze scrutinizing the boy's response. Isaac, eager to please, would pore over the few books Master Cedric allowed him access to, volumes filled with cryptic symbols and arcane knowledge. He learned about the four elements, the principles of transmutation, and the supposed connection between the celestial bodies and the earthly realm. It was during one of his cleaning duties that Isaac first encountered something that pricked at his youthful curiosity and sowed a seed of unease in his heart. While dusting a forgotten corner of the laboratory, behind a stack of heavy tomes bound in cracked leather, he discovered a small, wooden chest. It was locked, but the latch was loose, and with a bit of careful maneuvering, Isaac managed to pry it open. Inside, nestled amongst layers of faded velvet, were several small bones. They were undeniably human, the delicate phalanges of fingers and toes. A cold shiver ran down Isaac's spine. He quickly closed the chest, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. He replaced it exactly as he had found it, his mind racing. What were human bones doing in the laboratory of the royal alchemist? He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps they were remnants from some ancient study of anatomy? But the thought felt flimsy, unconvincing. Days turned into weeks, and Isaac continued his duties, the image of the bones lingering in the back of his mind. He began to notice other oddities. In a dark corner of the cellar, amidst sacks of dried herbs, he stumbled upon a collection of empty vials, their glass cloudy and etched with strange residues. Some bore labels written in a script he did not recognize, while others were simply marked with cryptic symbols. He also observed that Master Cedric sometimes received deliveries of large, unmarked crates late at night, brought by cloaked figures who spoke in hushed tones before disappearing back into the darkness. Cedric always oversaw the unloading of these crates himself, his usual stoicism replaced by an almost feverish intensity. One afternoon, while Master Cedric was away on a visit to the royal court, Isaac found himself alone in the laboratory. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire in the furnace. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Isaac began to explore more thoroughly. He knew he was risking Master Cedric's wrath, but the questions that gnawed at him were becoming unbearable. He examined the shelves more closely, his fingers tracing the labels on the various jars and bottles. He found containers filled with powdered metals, shimmering liquids, and strange, viscous substances that pulsed with an unnatural light. Behind a heavy curtain at the back of the laboratory, Isaac discovered a hidden alcove. It was a small, windowless space, lit by a single flickering candle. In the center of the alcove stood a large, intricately carved wooden table. Upon it lay several strange instruments, gleaming silver needles, intricately etched bowls, and a collection of sharp, obsidian knives. The air in the alcove was heavy with a cloying, sweet scent that Isaac found vaguely disturbing. He also noticed several stains on the wooden table, dark and reddish-brown in color. They looked suspiciously like dried blood. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a growing sense of dread, a cold premonition that something was terribly wrong. The bones, the strange vials, the unmarked crates, the hidden alcove with its disturbing instruments and stains. It all pointed to something far more sinister than the pursuit of life-extending elixirs. He remembered the hushed whispers he had heard among the servants about people disappearing from the poorer districts of the city, their disappearances often coinciding with Master Cedric's visits to the king. Could there be a connection? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He quickly retreated from the alcove, pulling the curtain back into place as if trying to conceal the disturbing scene from his own mind. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the miracle cures Master Cedric provided to the royal family might have a far more gruesome origin than he could have ever imagined. He had to know the truth no matter the cost. The unease Isaac felt that day in the hidden alcove festered within him, growing like a poisonous weed. He tried to focus on his daily tasks, grinding herbs and cleaning equipment, but his mind kept returning to the human bones, the strange vials, and the blood-stained table. He knew he could not simply ignore these unsettling discoveries. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. His investigation began subtly, almost unconsciously. He started paying closer attention to Master Cedric's activities, observing his interactions with the cloaked figures who delivered the mysterious crates, noting the times when the alchemist would lock himself away in the laboratory for hours on end, the furnace burning hotter than usual, emitting strange odors that permeated the entire building. He also began to scrutinize the ingredients Master Cedric used in his elixirs, cross-referencing them with the cryptic texts he had access to. He noticed a recurring mention of rare herbs and minerals, some of which were said to possess potent life-giving properties. But he also found references to more disturbing substances, ingredients associated with dark rituals and forbidden practices. One evening, after Master Cedric had retired to his chambers, Isaac crept back into the laboratory, armed with a flickering candle. He made his way to the hidden alcove, his heart pounding in his chest. He examined the wooden table again, the dark stains still visible in the dim light. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface, a cold dread creeping into his soul. He then turned his attention to the instruments laid out on the table. The silver needles were unervingly sharp, their tips gleaming in the candlelight. The obsidian knives were equally menacing, their edges honed to a razor's edge. He picked up one of the intricately etched bowls. It was surprisingly heavy, made of a dark, unidentifiable metal. Inside, he found faint traces of a reddish residue. As he explored further, Isaac noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked away beneath the table. It was not one of the ancient tomes Master Cedric usually consulted. This book was smaller, its pages filled with a delicate, almost spidery script. With trembling hands, Isaac opened it. The language was Latin, a language he had begun to learn from one of the discarded texts in the laboratory. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to decipher the words. What he read sent a wave of icy horror washing over him. The book was a journal, detailing a series of alchemical procedures, but these were no ordinary experiments. The entries spoke of the transfer of vital essence, of drawing forth the life force, and of bestowing the vigor of youth. The descriptions were vague, shrouded in alchemical jargon, but the underlying meaning was sickeningly clear. The journal described a process of extracting something precious, something vital, from one living being and transferring it to another. As Isaac continued to read, he found more explicit passages, references to willing donors and necessary sacrifices. He even found a few entries that described the physical characteristics of individuals who had undergone the process, their skin becoming pale and withered, their eyes losing their light, their bodies growing frail and weak. The dates in the journal corresponded with the times when Master Cedric had received the mysterious late-night deliveries. A horrifying realization began to dawn on Isaac. The life-extending elixirs were not the result of some miraculous alchemical process. They were stolen life extracted from unwilling victims. The human bones he had found, the strange vials, the blood-stained table, it all made a terrible, sickening sense now. Master Cedric was not just an alchemist. He was a monster, a predator who preyed on the vulnerable to prolong the lives of the privileged. And the royal family, whom Isaac had once admired from afar, were complicit in this horrific charade, unknowingly or perhaps knowingly consuming the stolen life force of others. Over the next few weeks, Isaac's investigation became more focused, more desperate. He spent every spare moment poring over the journal, trying to understand the full extent of Master Cedric's depravity. He learned about the rituals involved in the transfer, the specific ingredients required, and the phases of the moon under which the procedures were most potent. He discovered that the process was not a simple one, that it required a complex interplay of alchemical substances and arcane incantations. He also began to notice changes in Master Cedric. The alchemist, usually so reserved and stoic, seemed to possess a newfound vitality. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity. His movements were more energetic, and even his complexion seemed to have improved. It was as if he himself was drawing strength from some hidden source. Isaac couldn't help but wonder if Master Cedric was also a recipient of this stolen life force. One evening, as Isaac was cleaning Master Cedric's private study, he noticed a small, ornate box on the alchemist's desk. It was unlocked, and curiosity, coupled with a growing sense of urgency, compelled him to open it. Inside, he found a collection of meticulously detailed sketches. They depicted various individuals, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and terror. Each sketch was labeled with a name and a date. Isaac recognized some of the names. They were the names of people who had disappeared from the city in recent months. He also noticed a sketch that made his blood run cold. It was a drawing of himself, his youthful features rendered with unsettling accuracy. Beneath the sketch were the words, "The next offering." The realization hit Isaac with the force of a physical blow. He was not just an apprentice. He was being groomed, fattened like a lamb for slaughter. He was to be the next unwilling donor, his life force to be extracted and transferred to the aging members of the royal family. Panic seized him, a cold, paralyzing fear that threatened to consume him. He quickly closed the box, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He knew he had to escape, to flee this place of secrets and horrors before it was too late. But escape was a dangerous proposition. Master Cedric was powerful, influential, and undoubtedly ruthless. And the walls of the alchemist's residence seemed to close in around Isaac, trapping him in a web of fear and despair. He knew he had to find a way out, a way to expose the truth and save himself from the terrible fate that awaited him. The air in the laboratory, once filled with the promise of knowledge, now felt thick with the stench of death and the chilling premonition of his own doom. Sleep offered Isaac no respite that night. Every shadow in his small attic room seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. Every creak of the old house sounded like the approaching footsteps of Master Cedric. The image of his own sketch, labeled "The Next Offering," was burned into his mind, a constant reminder of the impending danger. He knew he couldn't wait. The ritual he deduced from the journal's entries and the lunar cycle was likely only a few nights away, coinciding with the next full moon. He had to act, and he had to act now. The following morning, Isaac moved with a newfound urgency. He performed his usual duties, but his mind was racing, formulating a plan. He knew a direct confrontation with Master Cedric would be suicide. The alchemist was physically imposing and possessed knowledge of arcane arts that Isaac could only begin to comprehend. His only chance was to escape and perhaps, in doing so, expose the truth to someone who might believe him. But who would believe an orphan boy against the renowned court alchemist? The thought was discouraging, but Isaac refused to give in to despair. As the day wore on, Isaac noticed Master Cedric preparing for something. The alchemist was more agitated than usual, barking orders and meticulously checking his instruments. He instructed Isaac to prepare a specific concoction, a viscous, purple liquid that shimmered with an unnatural light. As Isaac worked, he tried to appear as normal as possible, his heart pounding in his chest with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He knew this might be his last chance to gather information, to find something that could help him. While Master Cedric was briefly distracted, overseeing the movement of a heavy chest into the hidden alcove, Isaac managed to slip a small vial of the purple liquid into his pocket. He also snatched a few pages from the alchemist's journal, tearing them out carefully so as not to arouse suspicion. These were the pages that described the ritual in detail, the incantations, and the final, terrifying act of extraction. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the laboratory, Master Cedric summoned Isaac. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and resonant, "we begin the final preparations. The moon will be full in 3 nights. The royal family awaits the fruits of our labor." His gaze lingered on Isaac for a moment, a strange mixture of satisfaction and something else, something that looked almost like pity, in his ancient eyes. Isaac's blood ran cold. 3 nights. He had even less time than he thought. He knew he couldn't wait until then. Tonight was his only opportunity. He had to confront Master Cedric, not in a physical sense, but with the knowledge he had acquired. He had to try to reason with him, to understand the twisted logic that drove his horrific actions. Later that evening, after Master Cedric had consumed his meager supper and retired to his study, Isaac took a deep breath and approached the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch. Fear threatened to overwhelm him, but the image of his own sketch spurred him on. He had to try. He pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. Master Cedric was seated at his desk, poring over a large, leather-bound book. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Isaac, what is it?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of annoyance. Isaac stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the pages he had taken from the journal. "Master Cedric," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know what you are doing. I know about the rituals, about the transfer of life." Master Cedric's initial surprise quickly morphed into a cold, calculating gaze. He slowly closed his book, his long fingers resting on its aged cover. "And how did you come by this knowledge, boy?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Isaac swallowed hard. "I found your journal. I read it." A long silence hung in the air, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Master Cedric's eyes seemed to pierce through Isaac, assessing the extent of his knowledge. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "So, you know the truth. A truth that is not meant for the ears of a mere apprentice." "Why, Master Cedric?" Isaac pleaded. "Why are you doing this? Taking life from innocent people to prolong the lives of others?" Master Cedric sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Innocent? Life is a precious commodity, boy. It is not meant to be squandered on the weak and the undeserving. The royal family, they are the pillars of our society, the protectors of our realm. Their continued health and vitality are essential for the stability of the kingdom. But at what cost?" Isaac countered, his voice rising in desperation. "At the cost of innocent lives? Is that justice?" Master Cedric stood up, his gaunt frame casting a long shadow across the room. "Justice is a concept for philosophers, boy. I am an alchemist. I deal in the practicalities of life and death, and I have found a way to tip the scales in favor of those who matter." He stepped closer to Isaac, his eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. "And you, Isaac," he continued, his voice taking on a more sinister tone, "you were chosen for a purpose. You possess a rare vitality, a youthful energy that is exceptional. Your offering will ensure the continued prosperity of the crown." Fear coursed through Isaac's veins, but he tried to stand his ground. "I won't let you," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I won't be a sacrifice." Master Cedric merely chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You have no choice, boy. The preparations are almost complete. The ritual will proceed as planned." Realizing that he could not reason with the alchemist, Isaac knew he had to act quickly. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small vial of purple liquid. In a swift movement, he flung the contents of the vial into Master Cedric's face. The liquid splattered across the alchemist's skin, and he recoiled in surprise and pain, clutching at his eyes. "What have you done?" he roared, his voice filled with fury. Taking advantage of the distraction, Isaac turned and fled, bursting out of the study and racing through the darkened corridors of the house. He could hear Master Cedric's enraged shouts echoing behind him, but he didn't dare to look back. He ran blindly, his only thought to escape, to get as far away from this place of horror as possible. He burst out of the front door and into the night, the cool air stinging his lungs. He ran through the deserted streets of London, the sounds of the city strangely muted in the darkness. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He had to find someone who would believe him, someone who could stop Master Cedric's monstrous practices. As he ran, the image of the full moon, just a few nights away, loomed large in his mind, a silent reminder of the fate he had narrowly escaped, and the dark secrets that still lay hidden within the walls of the alchemist's residence. The whispers of the night seemed to carry a chilling promise of further revelations, a hint that his ordeal might not be over just yet.